Idaho College Public Forum, a student production. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the panel, it is a great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to yet another North Idaho College Public Forum. It is also a very special honor this evening for me, on behalf of the panel, to welcome to our program a most distinguished American. Our guest is Governor Tom McCall. As to background, he was born in the Bay State to two very prominent families. His grandfather on the maternal side was Thomas W. Lawson, a copper magnate and author of a history of the Republican Party. His paternal grandfather, Samuel W. McCall, was governor of that state and owner of the Boston Advertiser. Tom McCall, when he was very young, was brought with his family to the state of Oregon, where he grew up, and he graduated from the University of Oregon with a bachelor's degree in journalism. The governor in 1944 and 45 was a Navy correspondent in the Pacific, and in 1946 he returned to his state of Oregon and became a journalist in the Portland area. He has served in the capacity of newspaper work, and he's also been a commentator on radio and television. From 1949 to 1952, he was administrative assistant to Oregon Governor Douglas McKay. Then in 1964, he was elected Secretary of State in his home state. Then in 1966, he won the Republican nomination and was elected the governor of his state. In 1970, he sought re-election as chief executive and was overwhelmingly re-elected and served until and through the 1974 election. If one looks upon those 8 years as chief executive of his state, there are numerous accomplishments that one could talk about, and I'm sure many of those will be brought out in this program. He's known certainly as an expert on energy and environmental matters, and had over 100 programs in this field while serving as governor of his state. In addition to this, he has certainly been one of the most prominent governors at the National Governors Conferences and has been very influential in national politics. Among those awards that he has received includes the Conservationist of the Year Award for the past year, given by the National Wildlife Federation. Tom McCall, it's certainly a pleasure having you on our program.
Tony, great pleasure to be here.
I also want this evening to welcome back our three regular panel members. To my far left is Richard Heinemann, who has been in the process of completing his PhD at Washington State University and teaches on the faculty in the field of communication arts and is in charge and coordinator of the debate program. Welcome back, Richard.
Thank you, Tony.
Also back is Mary Lou Reed, who is a very active individual in both one of the political parties and in also environmental affairs throughout the Northwest. And as to educational background, she's a graduate of Mills College and did graduate work in theology and religion at Columbia University. Welcome back, Lou.
Thank you, Tony.
And to my immediate left is Dr. Ken Wright, who is chairman of the Division of Physical Sciences at North Idaho College, teaching the field of chemistry with his PhD from the University of Idaho. Welcome back, Ken.
Thanks, Tony.
We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first question from Richard Heinemann.
Governor, this is a political question. Former Nixon aide Patrick Buchanan, in commenting upon the recent shakeup in President Ford's cabinet and Governor Rockefeller's decision not to run in 1976, wrote, and I quote, that President Ford has again shortened the odds that he'll be the first Republican president in memory to lose the nomination of his own party. Do you agree that the odds are now shortened?
Well, as a moderate Republican, Dick, I'd say it was about as crude a handling of outstanding personnel as I can recall any time since the Saturday Night Massacre, except the torture of Rockefeller was more prolonged. And I think finally, after using the right wing and the minority of the minority, as Rockefeller refers to the people who were working on him, to manipulate, and some manipulation coming from within the White House itself, possibly the staff, that no man of dignity or person of dignity to save his self-esteem could take it any longer. And it's my opinion that the extreme vigor of the president's diatribe against New York, I just don't want to attribute motives, but I think it was so vigorous that it was calculated that the vice president, as a loyal New Yorker, couldn't take it, and therefore would have to say, he'd have to raise some protest as a man of responsibility and probity. So what happens now is going to be tremendously interesting. He was mistreated. He stayed longer and more amiably than he should have, but he got his self-respect back by what he did.
Well, can you foresee what role, if any, that Governor Rockefeller will play in the 1976 election?
We're very close friends, and I asked him about an hour after the press conference, where do the moderates go for leadership now? You led them for 12 years. He said, let's wait and see. I said, will you be a candidate for president in 1976? He said, let's wait for the dust to settle. More recently, I've discussed this with his great ally in politics, George Hinman, the Republican National Committeeman from New York. And it seems that he won't have any active role in terms of his own promotion for president ever again. But what happens with the delegation from New York may be of interest, because this is going to be a tremendous tester of how good a party man and how loyal a presidential supporter Rockefeller can be after the way he was mistreated by the power structure of his party. Because there's a big delegation from New York that's going to the Republican National Convention. And right now, a friend of mine on the scene called me and said, as far as the president is concerned, he's about as popular with Republicans in New York as Attila the Hun. So whether there is a neutral delegation and what Mr. Rockefeller does in rounding up delegates and so on, and what happens with liberals maybe getting into this race if all you have is Reagan and Ford, all these things are yet to occur that might really improve the chemistry of politics in this country.
Well, now, do you think this is a time perhaps for a new party of a more moderate, middle-of-the-road stripe?
Well, I've often thought, I gave a speech to the Claremont Men's Club in Los Angeles, where I enunciated publicly about 2 months ago that if Ford and Reagan were the only Republicans running in New Hampshire, or say a more liberal state, that certainly a liberal Republican would have to get in, because all you had running would be two Cadillac conservationists. And somebody's got to represent about 30% of the Republican Party, which is moderate and progressive, stresses environment, equity, freedom of speech, open government, and all the things that make a democracy work.
Well, Governor, of course, you've remained highly visible since you stepped down in Oregon. You're on Channel 2, aren't you, in Portland?
Yes, sir.
And various appearances around the country. Do you foresee any circumstances that may come up where you might decide to run again for public office?
Well, I'm not sure that I could see any place here except as a protest candidate, and I wouldn't consider it seriously. As a protest candidate just in New Hampshire, in case you just saw this dialogue getting narrower and meaner and more concentrated on returning the government to the people and cutting out red tape and not discussing any of the major issues of equity and energy and growth and national goals, that if that's going to happen, those two people are going to be winning a skirmish between each other, fighting to win a skirmish, but they're going to lose the war. So I would say that I wouldn't be a candidate certainly in '76 because of the money involved and the intense amount of work that would be involved, but we might look over running for some office in '78. You can't tell. There'll be a senatorship up, and I think our viewers ought to know that I didn't have to quit, that I didn't quit because I was defeated or anything. As a matter of fact, there's a two-term limitation by the Constitution, and a survey by a very reliable pollster in the Oregonian just a few days ago showed that in relation to holding the governorship, that 55% of the people would vote for me for governor today, as versus 33% for the next closest possibility. So that might be renewable. But maybe I've got to another life that I can build up going around as I'm going now, working on problems, encouraging people, being the cheerleader. And that is self-rewarding, plus the fact I can be on television, write, and have a good impact for good things in life in America.
All right, thank you.
Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Governor McCall, during the time that you were governor, you were a very good cheerleader for what you called the Oregon story. And you had many innovative programs which were a success in your state, the bottle bill, and you turned off the lights in '73. And I think my question has to do with why Oregon? Why is it possible in Oregon? Because going back historically to the time of the initiative and the referendum, Oregon has always been a little bit more receptive to new ideas. Is this a consistent thing? Do you have some answer for why is Oregon willing to try and experiment with new ideas?
It's hard to analyze, Lou, but the New Yorker had an article some months ago, and they said one of the drawbacks of government and self-governance was that government was so darn boring. And the Philadelphia Inquirer had a headline, "It doesn't have to be dull." And they told about Oregon. And they gave credit to innovative governors who had courage and a legislature that was not an ugly cliche, as a lot of them are, to use their language, but a legislature that also had courage. So that instead of fighting over partisan differences, as they do so often in this state, and in Washington, and in California, they were trying to out-innovate each other. And then pretty soon you'd reach a point where they could compromise and work on something. That the eye was on the ball, to use an athletic phrase. They didn't get their eye off the ball. Sure, they had some partisan skirmishing, but most of the headlines where they're involving legislative, gubernatorial relationships involve friction. And most of the headlines in Oregon involve reports of progress. And I think that is one of the great differences. And I think the people, even though they're somewhat conservative, are tremendously independent, and they have helped create this momentum. It's a three-ply legislative, gubernatorial, people operation. So all these things you say, you did, Governor, it's we did. And it's a remarkable team, and the Oregon story is sought all over America because it cheers people up.
I think I read someplace that you said that the states could be guinea pigs or could be experiments for some of these ideas. Do you see some of your things springboarding? Here you are, of course, going around and talking about energy. How about the bottle bill? Do you feel that it's going to go from the state level to the national level? What chances do you think it has?
Inevitably, the bottle bill and things like it are going to have to be adopted nationally and worldwide because the resources are not renewable that go into aluminum cans, for example, and that is getting low in supply, and the basic chemicals are getting low, and the fuel to make them is getting low. And so this is a tremendously important symbolic bill nationally and to a way of life all across the world, because all of a sudden we're saying you just don't take one drink out of it and throw it away. You're simply saying you're going to try to use that 30 or 40 times. And so there's a tremendous saving in expense in raw materials and energy, plus it fosters an ethic of cleanliness, so that you get out of your car, when you see a can on the roadside in Oregon, about every 3 months you see one. And if there's a six-pack carton there, you pick that up too. You scavenge around. And you have pride in this ethic. So I think it's going to be the bill and the law that bridges us across from a wasteful society to a husbanding society, from what I call an opulent society, until we're merely affluent. We're not going to have to suffer, but we're going to have to suffer the loss of tremendously wasteful living, and it's going to be good riddance. We're going to feel better, we're going to have more fun, and we're going to be more neighborly.
Just to tidy up this litter question, just one more question here, Tony. This morning, earlier today, you said that the bottle bill in Oregon had created jobs. Would you expand on that just briefly?
Well, one of the reasons that it's going to be difficult to put a bottle bill over is that you're going to have to phase it in so that displacements, say in iron mining, displacements in making cans, displacements in making bottles, are allowed to be reflected in the new pattern of employment that the bottle bill will cause, as it has in Oregon. And that is that the logistics of handling the bottles make more jobs than do all those jobs I mentioned combined. We can't get a handle on it, but I've seen a study in Illinois. They say it'll make 9,000 more jobs net. But it is a change, you see, to a service job from a production job. So that is the whole point. So in other words, handling the bottles takes more people than making the bottles.
Ken Wright.
Tom McCall, I've got a brief clarification question here, just in your answer to Dick Heinemann's question about the political race in '76. You characterized Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford as Cadillac conservationists, and I'm wondering if that's what you meant, or if you meant conservatives.
No, conservationists. I think that really the issue on which they're poorest is conservation, in the sense we view conservation here in the Pacific Northwest. And conservation to me is the wise use of your resources, and wise use means that you still use those resources, and at the same time you don't destroy them, and at the same time you have economic growth. So it is controlled growth versus wild, rampaging, ragged growth. And it's in a contained situation where there is progress with the least damage to the economy and the ecology at the same time. I don't think they know that's possible.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. We're going to deal a great deal in this program, I'm sure, with energy, since you were brought onto the campus of North Idaho College primarily to discuss that particular topic. But we hear so much in the news media about other problems, foreign relations and nuclear warfare and all the other inflation and recession. I'm wondering if you would care to rank for us just where you think energy should come in terms of a global problem. How do you think energy is really the most important problem we face, or?
Well, John Muir says, doesn't he, all you educators know, that everything is inseparable, everything is connected one with everything else. There's nothing that's disconnected in all of this, so you just can't say which is the most important, because we were talking with the press this morning, is food more important or is energy more important? Well, it takes a lot of energy to produce more food, if you're talking about chemical fertilizers. So it's all part of the growth formula of mankind, and it's inseparable. We ought to have an economic policy, we ought to have environmental policy, we ought to have an energy policy, they ought to be wrapped up in a growth policy, and that ought to be wrapped up in a set of national goals or international goals. But I certainly think that if you want to take what we don't want, that we'd much rather have a food race than an armaments race. I'd much rather have our selling $20 billion worth of food than $11 billion worth of arms, which we're selling in 1 year now. So, I mean, there is, it seems to me, a wrong emphasis that could be replaced on a basis that brings friends to us, keeps people alive, keeps a balance of unterror in the world, using food instead of arms as a symbol of trade. But arms are getting to be now a greater symbol of trade than they have been for a long, long time. So I would say that energy, when you look at it in the way it permeates all the other products, is probably as important as any single issue. Because if you solve the energy problem, and man could get along without being so contrary-wise with the rest of civilization, with his neighbors and so on, that you would be able to have a pretty stable world. Again, absent the mischievousness that's inherent in man himself. But as far as natural resources, assets, factors like that go, the energy is corrected. I think you're on your way home. Not that you want to go back to, in 1985, an independence where Cadillacs are the order of the day, and 10 miles per gallon is the order of the day. And we have the most profligate society in the world. But let's go back to a more moderate way of life. And I think accepting that, accepting neighborliness, trying to help other nations out and working with them constructively, that's the way we've got to go.
Governor, in relation to your own state where you served for 8 years, I read a story some years ago that I was most interested in. I want to take this advantage that I have to ask you about it. That you have made some statements in the past that industry was welcome in your state under certain conditions, and clean industry. And the story I read one time in relation to, I don't know what particular industry, but some regulations that were being applied to them, they threatened to close down in your state. And the wives in particular, some of the workers came to see you, I understand, and that they left that meeting in support of your position, and therefore industry did make some corrections. Would you share with us your thoughts on what you told those women, or how can we have growth in industry and employment yet have some regulations?
Well, this was a craft plant that had a lot of air pollution troubles because it was an old plant. It was obsolescent, and they were still trying to make it run, still putting millions of dollars in to clean it up. And so all of a sudden, the plant wasn't open on this certain day. So all the workers marched on the Capitol blaming me because we had them on a schedule, on a permit system to clean up that they were falling behind on. So we went on the front porch, the head of the Department of Environmental Quality and I, and they kept shouting, "Hitler, Hitler," you know, and they were full of venom. And I kept saying to the director, "They're speaking about you, L.B. Day." And he said, "No, it's your honor, Governor." So I said, "What you don't know is that you had a breakdown in your plant. And it's your management, not the government of the state of Oregon, that closed the plant." And then they absolutely were flabbergasted. And then they said, "Will you lead us in a march on the plant?" And I said, "I don't mean to be rude about mass action and demonstrations, but I don't believe in mob pressure. But I will go down this moment and discuss this problem with your management in the plant personally." And so we did. A lawsuit against the state was withdrawn. The management put out a circular explaining that it was their decision, and not the state's, to close down the plant because they had a major breakdown in part of the plant. So it was an interesting case. And we've been on the front porch of the Capitol many times and been called many names. And that's where some confrontations take place. But if you can be patient enough and know enough about the problem, sometimes you can turn those emotional situations into a victory for logic. And this is what happened that afternoon in Salem.
Thank you. Richard Heinemann.
Governor, do you feel that the recent decision of the 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Virginia stating that the Federal Organic Act of 1897 is still valid will have an adverse effect on the lumber industry in the Northwest if it is eventually extended throughout the United States? As you know, this is the so-called Monongahela decision to ban clear cutting on the forest lands.
Well, I was the recipient just a couple of weeks ago in New York of the Natural Resources Defense Fund Award of the Year. And some of the lawyers for the Defense Fund, which is the outstanding environmental legal corporation in the United States, were sort of upset about the possible expansion of that decision. I mean, they weren't all crowing victoriously about it. There's a case in the federal court in Portland to stop logging in the Bull Run area, which is the area of Portland's watershed. They're logging with horses. The horses wear diapers, as a matter of fact, to avoid land and water pollution. And one of the citations in the complaint is that logging violates the Organic Act. So here is a possibility if the court ruled in Oregon on the basis of the court in Virginia, then you would find an extension against clear cutting landing right here in the middle of the Pacific Northwest, or certainly in the state of Oregon, if they use that as precedent, that decision. So that is a possibility. Congress at the same time, as you know, Richard, is working on laws that would limit the liability of that decision, so that it would cover the southeast and not get out to the west, or cover areas where it was applicable in a silviculture way. I think that in the long haul it will cause better timber management practices if nobody forces it, nobody tries to expand it, nobody gets too flag wavy for or against it. If we can handle it logically, I think we can have better clear cutting, better forest management, maybe some more of it without clear cutting, and still not have all those dire threats to the forest industry of the West carried out as some people think it will be. So I ride that thing day by day and try to work toward a solution that gets the best out of that decision without causing us to cut down on our logging practices on the western side of the mountains of Oregon, which you know is composed of great rainforests, and they're non-shade resistant. So you have to start your fir trees generally in an open area. So it really had more application to Oregon and Washington in a damaging sense if it is spread out there and is made inexorable and 100% applicable than it did to any place else in the United States.
Well, what's the status of this case? You just mentioned this before the Portland court now in reference to the run.
All I know about it is it is filed, and the regional forester told me that there was the possibility of expanding the impact of the decision from down south to the Pacific Northwest by means of this case in Portland.
Well, then, would you tend to agree with this observation by David Hazelchek, who's regional spokesman for the Sierra Club, and this was his reaction to the Monongahela decision, that it might result in improved quality of timber, more lumber, and less pulp. And he goes on to say that we will be trading a reduction in national forest quantity for improvement in quality. Would you agree with that observation?
But it's going to be awfully hard to have the big operators in the Pacific Northwest accept that. We have a man I've been talking to who is working on a small tree farm basis, the raising of Douglas firs on a selective basis without clear cutting, and having a great deal of success. He doesn't want to get into controversy by coming on television because he's afraid he'll cause the ire of the big companies to be attracted to it. But I think maybe that he has a growing technique that if applied on down the line in a few years might be kind of a compromise answer that would do the things that the Sierra Club says the court order would do, and without wrecking the economy of Washington and Oregon and Idaho.
Thank you.
Governor, you have pointed out today that we generally do not have a national energy policy. I think when you were governor, you attempted to develop a state energy policy. But in the absence of a national energy policy, we have a lot of things going on that relate to energy, and I'd like to ask your opinion about Project Independence, for one. What do you think is going to do you think that this is a viable way to, do you think independence is possible in terms of energy?
As far as being self-sufficient as a nation could be possible, but we don't even know what the people who proclaim this independence have in mind. I think some of them have in mind going back in 1985 to exactly the way we were in 1965, wasting madly without a thought of conservation. And of course we're never going to get back to that basis. There aren't the resources to support it. Maybe there would be in the year 2000 or 1990 when you develop solar energy and all the renewable resources that perhaps were infinite. Maybe you could have that way of life again, but it's not going to be any more fun. And I think that if we took some of the waste out of life again, it would be more enjoyable to live. So my definition is that we're never going to get back to 1965 in independence 1985, and we shouldn't. And we shouldn't delude the public into thinking that we're going to go back to 10 miles per gallon.
How do you think we go about explaining to the public that this is a fact of life?
Well, I brought a clipping I got from one of our hometown papers last night. Although 74% of the American people think the energy shortage in the country is serious, which is an increase in the number who think it's serious, they have largely eased off in their personal efforts to conserve energy. You see? They believe it's more genuine instead of just saying it's something the oil companies invented. But they're not alarmed by it. And this is indicated by what happened in Portland. When all our gas lines were so long at the gas stations, we had precinct surveys around Portland showing that the people would vote overwhelmingly to use highway funds for mass transit. They knew they couldn't use their cars indefinitely. They could see these long lines. It was a tremendous inconvenience. As soon as the long lines ended, and apparently there was enough gasoline, there was a vote on the subject. Every one of those precincts that supported mass transit funds from the state voted about 65% against it. How short is the human memory? So it's a tremendously tough educational job, is what I'm saying. And I think the biggest thing we have to do is to go into some kind of compulsory configuration. Certainly the way California has, they've got a wonderful guy named Charlie Warren, who's called Mr. Energy in the legislature. He tried to get a bill through that said that the car has to get 20 miles per gallon, and every mile it falls below that, you pay 10% sales tax in its purchase. He missed it narrowly. And California is so big, with 18 million cars, that they can force Detroit to move. They're just like a nation. They can change Detroit completely around. So that's going to be one of the, one of the areas where we're going to see some action. So the percentage of people in this poll who have postponed a long trip by car has dropped from 58 to 35%. The percentage of those cutting back on driving in the nearest downtown metropolitan area has fallen from 62 to 51. The percentage of those who buy no more than 10 gallons of gas each time declined from 40 to 26, and so on. So we say it is genuine, but we don't think that the full impact is going to strike us now, so maybe we better live it up before the full impact does strike us. That must be the psychology behind these figures.
Do you feel that there should be mandatory controls at a state legislative level?
Well, we fought for a bill, as unpopular as it could be, because everybody says he's trying to be a dictator. So finally the legislature, trusting its governor, implicitly said, we'll give you emergency powers for 30 days. If those powers stay in more than 30 days, then we've got to have a special session of the legislature. And then we'll review them to see whether you still shall have those powers. But that would go into the shutting off of the lights and the mandating of how much travel and what your house temperatures ought to be, and the whole range of energy use would be mandated insofar as it was applicable on the people by the government. And we're going to lose some freedoms, but it seems to me that when there's no energy left, and the homes are cold, and we can't get around, that we've lost a lot more freedom than if we accept what is a kind of a rationing of a rare supply that's important to our lives.
Ken Wright.
Mr. McCall, you gained a good deal of national fame as the governor who invited people to visit Oregon but not to stay. Set off, I'm told, a whole rash of greeting card production and so forth. I'd like to get your reaction to a situation that's occurred. The city of Petaluma, California, recently had an ordinance that was going to attempt to limit their growth to a certain number of housing units per year. This decision was had suit brought against it in the courts, and the local court decided against the city of Petaluma. Recently, this decision has been reversed by the Court of Appeals in California, and I'm wondering, did you ever try hanging this in Oregon? I don't think you did, but did you? And if not, why not? And what do you think is going to be the outcome?
Well, there's a very important series of lawsuits taking place in this area. In New Jersey and Virginia, the lawsuits have run to this conclusion, that if this is intended to be racially discriminatory and to limit the movement of people because of race rather than the considerations of environment and health, then that is not valid. And the cases have been running against these kind of controls in New Jersey and Virginia. So you've got to be very careful about what the purpose is. Because I spoke in the most beautiful part of Virginia and had a huge land use meeting, and I'm sure those people didn't even want to park there, because some of the people who come from Washington had seen the beauty of this valley, and Gustanco, that had been the end of it. It's just been flooded. So I'm simply saying that this is very hopeful, and that if you can limit it to carrying capacity in a way that is not antisocial in terms of racial discrimination, that's the way to go. You should be able, with the tools that we have in Oregon, in the University of Florida, to make a measurement of how much a state can carry, how much a city can carry in terms of having a livable environment, neighborliness, and a balance within that city. And that's what it ought to be based on, not on some covert way of enforcing racial prejudice. So we've got to be very careful what the purpose is. I'm all for the idea because I think that the answer is to build up the inside of the cities, not the great big ones that are almost rotted out, maybe New York or Los Angeles or Detroit. But there are so many of them that lend themselves to improvement instead of our leapfrogging across this farmland with suburbia, which is the most wasteful use of land we've ever devised. Wasteful use of energy to get back and forth from work. High crime rates in the suburbs. So let's build up. They call it suburbia. I say let's build up urbana, where 70% of the people live, and make those cities bloom again. And there we're all together. There we're taking care of each other. There's the old neighborhood concept of living, where we see each other again. We're not always riding miles to buy an ice cream cone. So that's about the way I think about it.
Were you successful at initiating any of these programs while you were governor of Oregon?
Well, our land use planning is by far the most advanced, maybe in the world. And part of it is that agricultural land 1, 2, 3, and 4 is zoned exclusively for agricultural use in all of Western Oregon. And there are concessions made holding the taxes down for agricultural use. If you can prove that you really can't make a good living on that land, you can bug out of the program. This is one to watch because it is an amazing protective effort for the most precious of all the commodities we have left, which is the agricultural land, and the one we are mistreating most in terms of bulk and value to civilization. You bet, in Portland, you ought to see, which was voted the #1 city, the most livable city in America, large size, which is 100 miles from Eugene, Oregon, which was voted the most livable city in the United States, middle size, just 2 months ago. You ought to see what's happening inside the city limits of these places, you see. And the reason this survey was important was not so you go out, pound your chest, and talk about some more Oregon first, but they gave criteria in this survey, which was conducted by EPA, of what livability means, so that everybody can take these criteria and then measure how they can improve their cities. And you should have seen all the congressmen who never gave a hoot about anything except industrial development, all turning on EPA and saying, who are these false prophets? Who are these lousy surveyors who made this study that shows my city threw down at the bottom? It's going to cause a remarkable opening of eyes to some priorities that are very important, such as the quality of life.
Governor, I have read several reports that have indicated that by 2005, some of them are 30 years from now or 35 years from now, that the population of the world is going to double. And it's the most obvious fact that with the growth of population consuming more resources and requiring energy, and much of this is in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America in particular, what is going to happen to the world if this mushrooming population continues, or what can we do about it? Can we have any effect on this process?
Well, we can have some effect if people listen to us. If we're not becoming too suspect because of the gap between the third world and those who could help, if we had an atmosphere, of logic. But there is more than the answer that we just produce more food. Because out there, quite obviously, no matter if you put all the brakes on population now, with the time lag of the application of the braking, that there are going to be, 35 million people starving a year. So we've got to get somebody in this dialogue listening to us on population control. And we'll pledge our part to produce food and be the food basket of the world and be the technical advisor to these countries that are having bad startup products and so on. But we've got to hold the line just on rampant numbers in terms of increase in the population of the world. And I went on a tour with Garrett Hardin for NASA, and I think you know what he says. He doesn't talk about it too much anymore, but he has the lifeboat theory that you all know about, that we are a lifeboat. The lifeboat is almost full, and there are a lot of people swimming in the water screaming for help. But you can't pour more than 2 aboard without sinking the lifeboat. And that is a rough analogy of what the situation is regards population growth and food growth and the products of life.
Thank you. Richard Heinemann.
Governor, I read in the Oregonian a few weeks ago that State Representative Bud Byers, Democrat of Lebanon, was going to file a preliminary petition aimed at reinstating the death penalty in Oregon. I've sort of lost track. Was that petition filed?
That petition was filed, and
what is your attitude towards this?
well, Representative Byers said that if it saved one life, it would have been worth it. It's going to pass, I think, overwhelmingly. He'll get the signatures without any question, and he seems to think it's a deterrent. It isn't. I was one of those who were moderately for the abolition of capital punishment. I was president of the Oregon Prison Association at the time. And of course, if I saw some equal application of capital punishment, I mean, just say theoretically, the application where somebody who had over $10,000 in the bank would be convicted. Nobody but the poor, and mostly the black. Nobody's convicted. It's a matter of unequal justice. It is the worst drawback of it, plus the fact that it is legalized murder, plus the fact that civilization, because somebody committed murder, shouldn't get down in the gutter and try to murder this person who committed the murder. It degrades us. But on the other hand, I'm a perfectly normal human being, and there's nothing I'd rather see than Manson put to death. I mean, I have the ambivalence of somebody who knows that it's not going to be a model of deterrence, but I still have a feeling of loathing and hatred toward people like Manson and Marquette and Bowles. But this is a very hard thing to be objective about, and that's why, with so much frustration in the world and so much crime, there's no question if you had a national plebiscite on the death penalty, it'd pass 3-1, even though it isn't a deterrent, even though it is legalized murder on the part of society. But there is a new part of the ball game, and that is when you have terrorism, 4 terrorists commit a crime, they could be executed for, they're put in jail, 12 terrorists kill 15 people to get those others out of jail. And there's a chain reaction under terrorism that makes you look at public executions possibly in a different light. So I'm just as a citizen with feelings, I am ambivalent about it, because I know it's wrong to let my feelings get down to the point where I commit murder because somebody else did.
Well, and of course, yeah, the death penalty was abolished in 1964 in Oregon.
We've had it back and forth, Richard, off and on for 60 years. It's been voted in, voted out. Where you get a particularly heinous crime, then there is revulsion and the people voted in.
Well, has there been an increase in the crime rate in Portland or Multnomah County, Clackamas County, right through there?
I'm pretty sure that statistically, as far as its deterrent effect is concerned, nobody can prove. There have been national studies made that it deters. I mean, you'll find a state with it, and you'll find 5 states surrounding that state, and the state with it has a higher murder rate than the 5 states surrounding it, which don't have the capital punishment. But it's a very simplistic solution to a horribly complicated situation.
Fine.
Lou Reed.
Governor McCall, I'm still hung up on all these energy questions, so I'll ask you another energy one. Don Hodel of the Bonneville Power Administration has been talking about what he foresees as a coming shortage of electricity in the Pacific Northwest, and he has suggested that in the future there will have to be curtailments and allotments and perhaps an establishment of priorities. Who do you think should be establishing these priorities, and what do we do about the aluminum industries and the energy-intensive industries that I think Hodel said in Seattle something like maybe we're going to have to choose between Boeing and schools, which I think is a very cruel thing to be saying. But do you see this as as a problem and a possibility?
Well, I did a very intense interview with him on his views on television. He's a logical man, but the BPA administrator always is a growth man. He always grinds into his evaluations because his people will give the evaluation basis to him a lot of growth. And so you've got to go up so much and build this and build that. And consequently, we saw the BPA figures today that the slowdown, which some people blame on environmentalists, but also is blamable on the capital shortage and a lot of other things, including inflation, is going to cost us $8 billion by the time these nuclear plants and hydro plants are built. That's what I call one of the positions that is not down the middle, any more than the Sierra Club sometimes saying that, well, if we just conserved and hoped we could get by on sunlight, you see. There's a middle position. And I am really over the barrel on Alumax, which is an aluminum plant that wants to get into Oregon, because I supported legislation to make it possible for it to come in when I was governor. This is the last block of power that it wants left of that size and that cheapness in the United States, 240,000 kilowatts. And it would come out of the Northwest Power Pool. So you really have mixed feelings. If this were the first plant, aluminum plant, I'd say let's not have any, you see, in the Northwest. But on the other hand, if you build this plant, it provides 700 jobs. And if you didn't build it, that 240,000 kilowatts would provide 9,500 jobs. Do you want 9,500 more families drawn into the Northwest by those jobs? Or do you want to kiss them off with 700 jobs in the aluminum plant? This is a new generation of problems. You see what I'm saying? So I don't know what's going to come of it. And I would say that in a shortage era, when we were faced with the hydro shortage in '73, I had to withdraw my support of the building of the aluminum plant on the basis that it just was too much of a drain on power sources when the prices are rising too fast and the sources were getting more and more finite and more inadequate. So I've been on all sides of that issue, but the world has changed around me. The ballpark has been moved. So now I guess it probably shouldn't be built. But if they built it any time before we perceived the seriousness of the power shortage, there it was dangling for 6 years, but a lousy aluminum market prevented them from building it. Then it had been built, and I suppose we wouldn't be arguing it. But this is a good case in point, to be thinking of these things ahead rather than when they're on top of you.
How about the established aluminum plants? Do you feel that they could conserve more energy if they updated? Do you think that there is much waste going on in say, the established aluminum plants?
This is one thing an organization called the Center for Growth Alternatives, I'm on the board of, likes to consider. We notice that the government emphasis in conservation is always scapegoating the individual. And yet, our organization thinks there's a 30% saving that you can make in industry in power and energy use. And so I don't know whether that applies to aluminum plants or not. If they're really tightening down, I think they're naturally, and I think you know more than I do about it, they're a high energy using type of industry. There's no question about the highest in the whole business. I don't know whether they could save or not, but generally it's true of industry that there is tremendous saving. I visited the John Deere plant and they were so proud that they cut down, I think 12% one year, and they're going to cut down 13% more the next year at Moline, Illinois. So they were aware of it, and I just think that we've more than scratched the surface, but we haven't really come to the ultimate in energy saving by a darn sight, either industrially or individually.
Ken Wright.
Mr. McCall, as a chemist, there's a question I certainly am interested in, and I've got a student who's very interested, and I promised him I'd ask this question too. Oregon instituted, I believe, a ban against fluorocarbon sprays. Is that correct? One of the several states in the country that has.
The first.
All right, aren't there some others now?
But it was the first.
Oh, okay, first again for Oregon. I'm wondering, what's the justification for this? Do you think that the evidence was sufficient to justify this kind of a ban? What do you think the outcome will be? Is there enough evidence yet for any decision to be arrived at?
Well, in my radio commentary, was critical of the decision. when they passed it. But after they passed it, a federal task force of great stature confirmed that we should be suspicious of the effect on the ozone of this usage of these spray containers. So I had to turn around and say, although I would not have voted for it in the legislature on the basis of the evidence they had, I probably would have signed the bill on the basis of evidence that came in after after they passed it. I don't think they had enough definitive evidence to pass the bill. But they did a wise thing. They said the bill's not going to become effective until the 1st of February 1977. So they could have the regular session meet on January 2nd or 3rd, 1977, and if indeed the scientists would have proved it was a culprit, then they could let the law stand. If the science had proved, no, this is not the approach, this is not hurting the ozone, then they can repeal it. I guess they wanted to have another Oregon first, because the industry said Oregon is overreacting again. And thank God they, once in a while, do overreact, because 9 times out of 10, they're right.
Richard Heinemann.
Governor, in your address in January 1973 to the Legislative Assembly, you mentioned that you were in dire need, Oregon was in dire need of a state land use policy. I'm quoting you now, new subdivision laws, new standards for planning. So the interests of Oregon for today and the future must be protection from the grasping wastrels of the land. You feel that you've succeeded?
We haven't succeeded in saving Oregon. No one succeeded in saving any state from those who treat land with the buffalo hunter mentality, as we call it. But we did get a lot of good subdivision legislation, consumer protection legislation in land use, subdivision and building, and we did get Senate Bill 100, which is the basic land use planning law of the state, which has as one of its goals intensive public participation. So this commission, which is unpaid, held 70 hearings in one state, in 1 year, in that one state. And not many came, but at least we're moving with advisory committees and moving as openly as we can in a tough, emotional situation. Ronald Reagan comes to the state and he said, we've got to give government back to the people. I follow him on the platform and a man stands up and says, from Florence, Oregon, we're going to give government back to the people. Governor, we're going to repeal your Land Use Planning Act. Who are the people, I said. The people aren't those who are going to grind up and mutilate every last grain of earth in this world. The people aren't the exploiters. So, I mean, during this political dialogue, when somebody says give government back to people, see what people they mean. So we do have all those laws, except one of them on guaranteeing a house. The guarantees were so pro-purchaser that the lending industry refused to lend money, and we had to have a special session and repeal it. But otherwise, we have a mosaic of laws that handle subdivisions and land use planning, marshland planning, coastal planning, and we're moving on. And we got out of this last legislature $6 million, 4.4 to the cities and counties to do their planning. You got to make this distinction. They do the comprehensive land use planning, the cities and the counties. The state has 1.4 to direct it and homogenize it and make sure it's uniform and effective statewide. And that's the way we're moving ahead with the idea we might have 85% of it in place in 5 years.
In regard to the gentleman that you stood up and wanted to get the government back to the people, would you sort of agree with the statement made by, I read it come across the state senator Hector McPherson when he said, scratch a farmer and you'll find a subdivider?
He's an amazing guy. He was the author of Senate Bill 100. He's a dairyman, he's a farmer himself, and he was defeated in the next election. Our first land use bill in '68 very quickly came out of the Interim Committee on Agriculture, which was made up of farmers. Farmers who wanted to farm and not be engulfed by that great massive wave of suburbanization sweeping over their farmland. It's tough. All these things are tough. But you got to get on with them. And I've started an organization called 1,000 Friends of Oregon. which is a legal corporation. We're taking every gray facet of that law into court or into public hearing and trying to work it out, so that when that law is finally in place, somebody can't take it to the Supreme Court and have it struck down because it wasn't put together right. It's really, it's the most dedicated effort with the best basis that you can find in land use planning, I think, anywhere.
Fine, thank you.
Mary Lou Reed.
We've asked you all these weighty questions. Can I ask you a question about your mother? I became an admirer of her during her very brief candidacy for the governorship of Oregon, and I felt this was a wonderful independent spirit, and I'm sure that she kind of infused this into her children. I'm curious, has she had a great response from women around the country who really admired what she had to say? And do you get questions like, does she get questions like, how did you raise an independent son like Tom McCall?
Well, she really gets a lot of discussion every place she goes. And they did a television series on her last week, all week long, on a commercial station. They went up to the ranch. And she's 87 years old. She was absolutely charming. I mean, they came near the end, and they asked if she ever thought about dying. Well, of course she never didn't admit she ever did. She said no, she never looked that forward. She never looked back either. She made an awful lot of mistakes in her life, but she always remembered, who was it, Lot's wife, who turned into a pillar of salt, so she never looked back. After her candidacy, which was covered by all the major networks, which sent crews up from Hollywood, Governor Waller of Mississippi met me in the hotel in Washington with his arms outstretched. He ran across the lobby and he said, "Governor," he said, "you know who's the #1 politician in Mississippi? It's your mother." The Southerners were crazy about her. She's sort of like a Winston Churchill in skirts. And of course she's not going to run, but she's so cute. She told me she didn't think she'd run after 21 days, but it was enough. She didn't want to get into the muck of politics, but she confided in me that maybe next time when she had more seasoning, she might make the race. So we may have a 90-year-old candidate there for governor.
With that, we'd like to bring our program to conclusion. That's a wonderful note on which to end our program. On behalf of the panel and all those who've been responsible for the programs on campus today, Governor, it's been a tremendous pleasure having you here, and what is so wonderful about having someone like you, it stimulates our thinking, and I'm sure that we perceive some more ways of solving some of our problems, and we thank you very much.
It's been great to be here. Good panel, good questions, very interesting, as far as I'm concerned.
Ladies and gentlemen, I certainly hope you've enjoyed our program. This evening, our guest has been Tom McCall, who served as governor of the state of Oregon for 8 years and certainly has been a very prominent national political figure in the Republican Party. I hope you'll be with us again next week when we'll be interviewing another personality of the United States. And until that time, good evening and thank you.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. The preceding student production was brought to you by videotape recording.